Zyra stood at the observation window of her sleek spacecraft, her dark eyes scanning the swirling nebulae and distant stars. She was an officer of the Galactic Union, a proud species whose history stretched back millennia. To her people, humans were a primitive race, nothing more than a brief footnote in the vastness of the galaxy. The Union had tolerated their existence, but that was all. Zyra had heard the stories, the warnings, the lessons taught since childhood. Humans were weak. They lacked discipline, intellect, and strength. It was no wonder the Union barely acknowledged their existence. Yet, as she stared out into the endless expanse, Zyra's thoughts drifted. She had come to this human colony as part of a diplomatic mission, one that was meant to be simple: exchange pleasantries, offer advice, perhaps build a stronger alliance. Nothing more. It was supposed to be routine. It should have been. But then, everything changed. Without warning, alarms blared throughout the ship. Zyra's sharp senses immediately caught the sound, and her heart skipped a beat. The vibrations beneath her feet told her something was wrong. She spun toward the control panel. The alert flashing on the screen made her blood run cold. Attack in progress. Her mind raced. The galaxy was full of dangers, but none of them had ever felt real to her before, until now. "Shields at 30%. Multiple ships closing in fast," the voice of her navigator echoed over the comms. Zyra's hand moved automatically to the weapons controls, but her training kicked in. Her people were technologically advanced, but even their weapons couldn't guarantee survival in a surprise attack. Her thoughts flashed to the humans below her. They were not equipped for this. They had nothing that could match the power of the attackers. "Commander Zyra, we're under fire," the voice of her tactical officer crackled in her ear. Panic creeping into his voice, Zyra's pulse quickened. Her eyes darted over the control panel, trying to make sense of the rapidly deteriorating situation. She knew the best course of action was to escape, to flee and regroup. But the ship was already damaged, and there was nowhere safe to hide. A loud explosion rocked the vessel, sending Zyra stumbling to the floor. Her head slammed against the metal surface, and for a moment, everything went black. When she regained her senses, she was still on the floor, disoriented. The lights flickered, casting the ship in eerie shadows. Sparks flew from a nearby panel, and smoke began to fill the room. Zyra pushed herself up, gripping the edge of the console to steady herself. "Status report," she barked, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. "Engines are offline," came the weak response from one of the engineers. "Life support is failing. Shields are gone. We're sitting ducks." Zyra took a deep breath, her mind racing. The attackers were too close. The humans below her would never survive this. And then, in the midst of the chaos, the decision was made for her. The ship lurched violently, throwing her to the ground once again. A cold, sharp pain shot through her side. She gritted her teeth and pushed herself up, ignoring the searing ache in her body. The ship was breaking apart, and they were all going to die if something wasn't done. Her thoughts turned to the human colony below. My dad. Could they help? Could they even defend themselves against this threat? Zyra made a snap decision. She turned to the nearest escape pod. It was a long shot. Human technology was not nearly as advanced as her people's, but it was their only hope. Her body screamed with pain as she stumbled toward the pod, forcing her way through the damaged corridors. The ship groaned as it was torn apart around her, and the sound of explosions echoed in the distance. She couldn't think about that now. She had to survive. Finally, she reached the escape pod bay. It was chaotic, with crew members scrambling for their lives. Zyra took a moment to steady herself before she climbed into the nearest pod. The hatch slammed shut behind her, sealing her in. The pod shot out of the wreckage, tumbling through space toward the planet below. The black void stretched out around her, and she wondered if she would ever see her people again. She focused on the task at hand: survival. The pod jolted as it broke through the atmosphere. The shaking intensified as it plummeted toward the planet's surface. Zyra's grip tightened on the controls. She had no idea if the pod was equipped for a safe landing, but she wasn't about to die like this. With a final brutal crash, the pod hit the ground, Zyra was thrown forward, and everything went dark again. When she woke, the first thing she noticed was the silence. The pod had crashed in a forest, far from the nearest human settlement. Her body ached all over, and the pain in her side had intensified. She was alone, her crew gone, her mission failed. For a long moment, Zyra lay there, stunned by the realization that she had survived. But at what cost? Her body was battered, her ship destroyed, and she had no idea what to do next. She struggled to sit up, her vision blurred from the impact. The alien terrain around her was unfamiliar, green, lush, with towering trees that reached high into the sky. The air smelled strange, filled with the scent of flowers and earth. There was a strange beauty to it, but it wasn't the kind of world she had ever expected to be on. Zyra gritted her teeth and pushed herself to her feet. Her head swam with dizziness, but she forced herself to stand tall. She needed to figure out her next move. She had no way of communicating with her people, and no way of knowing if they had survived the attack. It was then that she heard something. A sound. Footsteps. Boah. She froze, her heart racing. Who could it be? She instinctively reached for the weapon at her side, but it was gone. The crash had ruined everything. A figure appeared through the trees. Zyra's breath caught in her throat. It was a human. A man, wearing simple clothing, carrying a strange pack. Zyra's instincts told her to flee, to retreat. But she was too weak to move. Her fear surged once again. The humans had always terrified her. Weak, primitive, unpredictable. But this man was different. His eyes locked onto hers with a calmness she had never seen before. He did not seem afraid of her at all. He stepped closer, his movements cautious but steady. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low and surprisingly gentle. Zyra's mind raced. She wanted to respond, to tell him to stay away, but her voice caught in her throat. She had never been in a situation like this before, and the fear she had always felt toward humans suddenly seemed insignificant in the face of what was truly at stake. For the first time in her life, she realized just how alone she was. And she had no idea who this human was, or why he was helping her. But as he knelt down beside her, offering her a hand, something inside her stirred. She was afraid. But there was also something else. Something she couldn't quite place. Zyra could feel the man's gaze on her as she hesitated, her body trembling with both fear and exhaustion. She had never been this close to a human before, and the strange vulnerability she felt was unsettling. Her entire life had been defined by her people's belief in their superiority, their power over others. And now here she was, stranded on a foreign planet, at the mercy of a creature her kind had always considered insignificant. But the man didn't seem threatened by her. In fact, his expression was more concerned than anything else, as if he saw her not as a powerful alien officer, but as a fellow being in need of help. He knelt down closer, offering her a hand. His touch was rough but gentle, and for some reason that small gesture made Zyra feel safe in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. It made her uneasy. She had been taught all her life that humans were primitive, irrational. But here, in the silence of the forest, the man's calmness seemed to defy everything she had been taught to believe. Zyra wanted to pull away, to stand up and walk away, but her body refused to obey. The crash had drained her strength, and the pain in her side had only gotten worse. She could feel the bruises forming under her skin, the cuts and scratches from the debris of the destroyed escape pod. "Are you hurt?" The man's voice was quiet, but there was something reassuring about it, something warm and kind. It made Zyra pause. She looked up at him, trying to form words, but her throat felt dry. She nodded slowly, wincing as the movement made the pain flare up. He didn't wait for her to speak. Instead, he pulled out a small pack from his back, rummaging through it with ease. A moment later, he produced a small med kit. Zyra watched him with growing confusion. She had never seen a human carry such equipment. They were always so simple in their ways. How was it possible that this man, a human, had the tools to help her in a way her own crew could not? "You're lucky I carry this stuff," he said with a small, almost sheepish grin. "I know the basics." "I'm no doctor, but I've patched myself up more than once." Zyra didn't respond. Her mind was spinning, trying to process everything. The man's calmness, his lack of fear, and the fact that he was willing to help her without hesitation, despite the danger she represented. It was all so confusing. The man gently moved her jacket aside to get a better look at the injury. Zyra flinched at his touch, but he didn't pull away. Instead, he worked efficiently, applying a gel-like substance to the cut on her side, binding it with a bandage. She winced again as he tightened the wrap, but it was a relief to have the bleeding stopped. "Better?" he asked softly. Zyra nodded, though she was still too stunned to speak. "You should be careful," he added, his voice soft. "That's a deep cut. You need to rest." Zyra wanted to argue, to tell him that she didn't need his help, but her body betrayed her. The pain, the exhaustion. It was too much. Her eyelids felt heavy, and before she could protest, she found herself leaning against the tree, her eyes closing in spite of herself. The man didn't seem to mind. He sat down on the ground next to her, his back leaning against the trunk of the tree, his eyes scanning the area around them. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, but it was heavy with unasked questions. Zyra didn't know how to break it. She had always been so sure of herself, of her mission, of her place in the universe. But now, sitting here, with a human beside her, she felt lost. The man, though, seemed content to let the silence stretch on. He wasn't in a hurry. Finally, after what felt like hours, he spoke. "My name's John," he said, turning to her with a small smile. "I don't know if you can understand me or not, but I figure it's worth trying." Zyra blinked, surprised by his introduction. In all the time she had spent among humans, she had never expected one to be so open with her. She had expected them to fear her, to avoid her. Yet here was John, sitting beside her, as if this was any normal encounter. "Zyra," she said softly, her voice hoarse. She felt strange saying her name to him, as if giving him a part of herself she had never shared with anyone before. John's smile widened at the sound of her name. "Zyra. That's a strong name. You must be someone important." Zyra didn't know how to respond. She was important. She was an officer, a leader in her own world. But now, sitting here on a strange planet, injured and vulnerable, she felt like nothing. John didn't push her to explain. He just nodded, as if understanding more than he let on. For the next few hours, he did not ask her more questions. Instead, he offered her food, something small but filling, and sat beside her as the sun began to set. Zyra couldn't help but notice the quiet, the peacefulness of this planet. The air smelled fresh, and the sounds of wildlife echoed through the trees. It was nothing like the bustling, mechanical cities of her people. It was a simple, raw world. John had told her little about himself, only that he had once been a soldier, now living a quieter life. He didn't mention where he came from, or how he had ended up on this planet, but Zyra wasn't ready to ask. She wasn't ready to learn more about him yet. Instead, she let the quiet fill her thoughts. For the first time in a long while, she felt her fear beginning to fade. She didn't know why, but there was something about this human that made her feel safe. Even as all of her instincts screamed that this was wrong, that she should not trust him, something in her resisted that fear. As the night deepened, John stood up and stretched. He glanced at Zyra, then back at the sky. We should get some rest, he said. You need to heal, and I need to make sure we're not followed. Zyra nodded slowly. She knew he was right. She didn't have the strength to argue. He motioned for her to follow him as he made his way deeper into the forest, where a small makeshift shelter had been set up. A simple but effective shelter made from branches and leaves. It wasn't much, but it would keep them safe for the night. Zyra reluctantly followed, her mind still whirling. She had spent her entire life seeing humans as weak and insignificant, but here she was, relying on one for her survival. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but something deep inside her told her that John was different. When they reached the shelter, John gestured for her to rest. He offered her a blanket, and she took it, wrapping herself in its warmth. She lay down on the ground, staring up at the stars. Her mind was full of questions, but the silence of the night seemed to hush them. I'll watch for a while, John said quietly, sitting down near the entrance to the shelter. You get some sleep. You're safe here. Zyra didn't know if she could trust him completely, but she didn't have the energy to doubt him either. Slowly, her eyelids grew heavy, and sleep overtook her. For the first time since the attack, she allowed herself to drift off into an uneasy but peaceful slumber. Zyra awoke to the soft sound of birds chirping in the distance. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting a gentle glow across the forest floor. She stretched, wincing as the muscles in her side protested. The pain had subsided somewhat overnight, but the injury was still there, a reminder of the chaos she had narrowly escaped. She sat up slowly, taking in her surroundings. The shelter was small but effective, constructed from thick branches and woven leaves. John was sitting nearby, his back against a tree, watching over her as he had promised. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the surroundings as if he expected danger at any moment. For a moment, Zyra simply watched him. His calmness was a stark contrast to the chaos she had left behind. He had been her savior, yet she still couldn't fully understand him. Why had he helped her? What did he want from her? Was this just some strange form of survival instinct on his part, or was there something more? John glanced at her, catching her gaze. His lips quirked into a small smile, one that seemed genuine, but there was a quiet sadness behind it. You're awake. How are you feeling? Zyra hesitated before answering, not wanting to reveal how weak she still felt. Better, she said, her voice hoarse. Thank you. John nodded, his smile fading slightly. You don't have to thank me. It's just what I do. Zyra didn't know how to respond. She had been raised to believe that humans were self-serving creatures, driven by greed and personal gain. And yet, here he was, offering help without asking for anything in return. The question gnawed at her. Why was he helping her? John stood up and stretched, then gathered a few items from around the shelter. We need to get moving soon. I'm sure the attackers are still searching for you. Zyra's heart skipped a beat at the reminder. She had forgotten about the other ships, the ones that had attacked her vessel. She had been so focused on surviving that she hadn't given much thought to the dangers still lurking on the planet. She needed to find a way to contact her people, to let them know she was alive, but her communications equipment was destroyed in the crash. Do you know where we are? Zyra asked, pushing herself to her feet with some difficulty. John looked around the dense forest, his brow furrowed in thought. No idea. This is a remote part of the planet. I've been here for a while, though. I know how to navigate through the terrain. We can move faster if we stay on foot. Zyra nodded, though a small part of her resisted the idea. She didn't want to leave the shelter, the only place she had felt a semblance of safety since the attack, but she knew that staying put wasn't an option. The longer they stayed here, the more dangerous it became. I'll be fine, Zyra said. Though her voice wavered slightly, she could feel the weakness in her legs, the lingering fatigue from the crash and the wounds she had suffered. But she couldn't afford to show it. Not to John, and certainly not to herself. John gave her a look that said he wasn't entirely convinced, but he didn't argue. Instead, he picked up a pack and handed it to her. Take this. It'll help. Zyra hesitated before accepting the pack. It was a simple thing with only the bare essentials: water, food, rations, and a few tools. She should have expected as much from a human. They didn't have the advanced technology her people did, but they had what they needed to survive. Together, they moved out of the shelter and into the forest, the dense trees forming a canopy above them. The air was thick with the scent of earth and growing plants. Zyra was still adjusting to the simplicity of this world. Everything here felt so raw, so different from the polished metallic cities of the Galactic Union. As they walked, Zyra couldn't help but notice the way John moved. He was cautious but not afraid. He knew the land, the terrain. His steps were sure, calculated. He didn't rush, but neither did he hesitate. He knew what he was doing. She had always been taught that humans were unpredictable, impulsive, but John was nothing like what she had been told. He was controlled, steady, and as much as she hated to admit it, that steadiness was beginning to draw her in. After hours of walking, they reached the edge of the forest. The dense trees gave way to a wide, open plain. In the distance, Zyra could see the faint outline of a small settlement. Humans. Her pulse quickened. This was the first sign of civilization she had seen since the crash. She could get help here, or at the very least, find a way to send a message to her people. John stopped in his tracks and turned to face her. "That's the nearest human settlement," he said, his voice quiet. "We'll be safe there for a while." Zyra looked at the settlement, her mind racing. She had been taught that humans were weak. They had no place in the grand scheme of things, no importance in the galaxy. And yet, here she was, relying on one of them to survive, to help her. Her mind flashed to her people, the Union. She had been a proud officer, a symbol of their strength and wisdom. Now she felt like a lost child, depending on a human for her survival. John must have sensed her hesitation, because he spoke again, his voice softer now. "I know it's hard to trust, Zyra. I get it, but we're in this together now. You don't have to do it alone." Zyra looked at him, her throat tight. She wanted to argue. She wanted to tell him that she didn't need his help, that she could survive on her own. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she nodded. She had no choice. The two of them walked toward the settlement, the wind picking up as they neared. The landscape around them was barren, a far cry from the lush forests they had just left behind. As they reached the edge of the settlement, Zyra noticed the simple structures that made up the human homes. They were small, modest. The people inside were going about their daily lives, unaffected by the alien officer in their midst. It was a far cry from the rigid, controlled cities of the Galactic Union. John led her to a small building at the center of the settlement. It looked like a workshop, with tools and machines scattered around the area. Inside, a few humans were working, their focus on their tasks. They didn't even seem to notice the alien woman standing in the doorway. John approached one of the men, a broad-shouldered human, with a weathered face. "We need supplies," he said, "and a place to stay for a bit." The man looked at Zyra, his eyes narrowing for a moment, then nodded. "You got it. We don't get many visitors around here, but I guess you're an exception." Zyra felt a pang of discomfort at his words. She was an exception, wasn't she? She had never imagined being in this position. John turned to her, sensing her unease. "It'll be all right," he said softly. "They're good people. They'll help." Zyra nodded, though she wasn't sure if she believed him. She was too proud to show her uncertainty, but deep down she feared the human's reaction. She was an alien, after all. She didn't belong here. But as she stepped further into the workshop, she couldn't shake the feeling that, for the first time in her life, she might have found a place where she truly belonged. Zyra sat quietly in the corner of the small workshop, watching the humans move around her. She was acutely aware of how out of place she felt in this world. The simple wooden walls, the smell of metal and oil, the worn but functional tools scattered on tables. None of it was familiar to her. Back home, everything had been so controlled, so precise. Her people thrived on order, on structure. But here, there was nothing but a quiet, humble existence. No one seemed to notice her, at least not in the way she was used to being noticed. She wasn't a powerful officer or a commander here. She was just another being, another stranger among them. The man who had helped her, John, sat across the room, talking to one of the humans. The man was gruff, but he had a kind face, with laugh lines around his eyes that gave him a warmth that Zyra hadn't expected. They spoke in low voices, and Zyra couldn't help but overhear snippets of their conversation. She understood most of what they said. Her knowledge of their language was good, but it was the tone, the casualness, that she couldn't quite grasp. Her thoughts drifted back to the crash, to the attack on her ship. She had barely escaped with her life, and now she was here, alone and dependent on a human. A strange, unexpected twist of fate. Her people had always dismissed humanity as weak, as nothing more than an obstacle in the grand scheme of the universe. Yet here she was, relying on a human for survival. The irony was not lost on her, but the reality was undeniable. John returned to her side after a while, carrying a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "We got you a place to stay for now," he said, his voice gentle. "It's not much, but it's safe." Zyra stood up, her legs still sore from the long trek. She had spent most of the day in the workshop, trying to rest, but her mind wouldn't stop racing. She hadn't expected to feel so vulnerable, so exposed. Her people had always prided themselves on their superiority, on their strength. And now, here she was, alone on a foreign world, dependent on those very beings she had been taught to look down upon. John led her outside, where the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the land. The settlement was small, no more than a handful of buildings scattered across a wide expanse of grass and dirt. It was quiet here, too quiet for someone like Zyra, who had spent her life in the bustling cities of the Galactic Union. The world felt slow, almost stagnant, compared to what she was used to. As they walked toward the small cabin where Zyra would stay, she couldn't help but wonder about the humans around her. What were they like, really? They had shown her kindness, but what was beneath that? Could she trust them? Could she trust John? She glanced at him as they walked. His face was calm, but his eyes held something else, something she couldn't quite place. He had told her that he was once a soldier, but now he lived a simpler life. It made no sense to her. Why would someone who had seen the horrors of war choose to live in such a peaceful, isolated place? "John," she said, her voice soft but steady, "why are you helping me?" He looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "Why wouldn't I?" he replied simply. "You're a person, just like me." "I don't know what's going on with your people, but that doesn't mean you deserve to suffer." Zyra was silent for a moment, trying to process his words. In her experience, humans didn't think that way. They were selfish, driven by their own desires, their own survival. But John didn't seem to care about that. He didn't seem to have an agenda. They reached the cabin, and John opened the door, gesturing for her to enter. Zyra hesitated before stepping inside. The cabin was small but cozy, with a simple bed in one corner, a small stove, and a table with chairs. It was far from luxurious, but it was a shelter. It was a refuge. It was something she had never imagined she'd need. "You can rest here," John said, setting the bundle down on the bed. "I'll be outside, making sure everything's secure." "You'll be safe here," Zyra nodded, though she didn't feel entirely convinced. Her instincts were still on edge. She had been taught to never trust, never rely on anyone, especially not humans. But something about this place, about John, made her feel, different, safe in a way. After a long silence, she spoke again. Do you ever regret it, choosing this life? After everything you've seen? John's expression softened, and he leaned against the doorframe. I used to think I did, he said.
But not anymore. I've seen enough destruction to last a lifetime.
This. This is enough for me now. Zyra looked at him, her mind reeling. She didn't understand. How could anyone be content with such a simple life? Her people had always strived for greatness, for power. And yet here was John, a human, content with what seemed like nothing more than survival. I don't understand, she admitted quietly. Why would you choose this? You've seen war. You've seen the galaxy. Why settle for this? John gave her a small, rueful smile. Maybe I didn't want to be part of all that anymore. Maybe peace is better than power. Zyra stared at him for a long time, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion. She had always believed that power was everything, that it was the only thing that mattered. But now, sitting in this tiny cabin, listening to John's words, she began to wonder if maybe there was more to life than just domination, than just winning. She didn't have the answers, and maybe she never would, but she was starting to realize that perhaps there was more to humanity than she had been taught to believe. Perhaps they were capable of more than survival. Perhaps they were capable of something far greater, something she had never allowed herself to understand. The hours passed slowly, and Zyra sat by the window looking out at the peaceful landscape. The night was falling, the stars beginning to shine brightly in the sky. For the first time since she had arrived on this planet, she allowed herself to relax, to breathe deeply without the weight of fear hanging over her. She wasn't sure what would happen next. She didn't know if she would ever return to her people, or if they would even want her back. But she did know one thing. She wasn't alone anymore. She had someone who cared for her, someone who had shown her that there was more to this universe than just conflict and conquest. There was kindness, there was humanity, and for the first time in her life, Zyra felt like she might be ready to see humans not as a weak, inferior species, but as equals. She wasn't sure how it would all work, but she was willing to find out. As she lay down on the bed, the weight of the day finally catching up with her, she closed her eyes and allowed herself to sleep, her thoughts peaceful for the first time in what felt like forever. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, but for now, she was safe, and that was enough.